Hello, Capital H listeners. This is David Mallon, your co-host and head of research for Deloitte Human Capital in the U.S. Today, I'm joined by an old friend, David Wilkins from TalentNeuron. He's a recognized leader in workforce analytics and the future of work. He helps organizations use data to design more dynamic job structures, strengthen workforce planning, and make confident talent decisions. Today, we're going to talk about something that on its surface seems very, esoteric, but is actually remarkably important to organizations, and that is job architectures. How we rethink job architectures, how we tie our business strategies to skills, and what leaders can do to stay ahead of constant workforce shifts. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
So let's dive into this topic of job architectures. Just maybe for our listeners' benefits, just start by what exactly is a job architecture and why is it an important foundation for what companies want to do, let alone HR?
Sure. Great opener. As you said earlier, complex subject that's wrapped in what seems like a really simple wrapper, right? I think at a base level, I think of job descriptions and job architectures as fundamentally the way that you organize the work in the business outside of your org structures. So how do you think about job families? How do you think about the individual roles within those and how all of that rolls up to functions within the business? The next level down from that, though, at the individual level of a role, you need to think about descriptions, you need to think about skills, you need to think about tasks. And that's sort of your baseline in order to connect the dots between the way the work is going to happen, the skills that are required among the people doing the work, and the intended work outputs. So to your point, it's a linchpin glue necessary componentry across the entire HR function, not just individual parts and pieces. And I think that's probably one of the bigger challenges is that often it's owned by individual siloed parts and pieces.
Where do they live?
Today, a lot of times it lives in comp and ben, right? So when we talk to clients and try to understand who owns the job architecture and then ultimately who owns the skill architecture, a lot of time it's a comp and ben team and it's a comp and ben driven sort of purpose. But
because this is how they're defining a job.
That's how they're defining a job, which then in turn defines the compensation, defines the associated remuneration and overall strategies in that regard. But as you've sort of alluded to, it's actually a central force that should underpin L&D strategies, your TA strategies, your SWP strategies. And so it has a broader utility across the HR function, but it's often like owned in individual silos.
Practically speaking, this is in your kind of core HR system, or is it?
Well, it can be in your core HR system. Sometimes it lives in a CSV file.
Okay.
Right, which is a very common case, even for very large organizations.
Which would get to my next question, is sort of what are the big challenges with even knowing what's in them, let alone keeping them up to date?
Yeah, I think the keeping them up to date is a tricky thing. What we frequently hear from organizations is that they haven't updated their job architecture, their job descriptions, often in years. They're often not at the right level to support the activities that are now prominent among HR practices, like strategic workforce planning, like reimagining the balance between AI and automation and human-led work. You have to have your job architecture at a sufficiently level of depth in order to drive those kind of conversations. And a lot of times when they're driven by comp and ben, David, I think they tend to stop, as an example, at software engineer. That's a frequent case that we run into.
To sort of enforce kind of an artificial simplicity, this notion that you only have one role. You're ever going to only have one role.
Yes, that is exactly it. And you think about that example where things go down to the level of a software engineer, and that makes things easy potentially from a simplicity standpoint. But what it doesn't get you is to nuance. So within software engineer, you have cloud engineering, you have DevOps, you have quality engineers, you have people that are working on AI strategies and LLMs, and folks who are working on Python and front end and back end. And all of those people have different comp bands. All of those people have different skill profiles. The availability of those people in the marketplace from a talent perspective is quite different. The demand for those kind of roles is quite different. And if you're going to start forward leaning into where you can expect to use automation or AI, you need to understand to that level of role what tasks are required, what skills are required. Where will you see skill adjacency in your SWP strategy? You don't know that if you haven't gone to the right level in that job architecture. So it is central to many of those things.
It makes sense to me, but how do you, there's a reason why they still are anchored in many cases to compensation and benefits. The organization does require a degree of stability attached to them. How do you balance that? How do you balance the sort of need to build some flexibility or agility into the architecture, but keep it stable enough for the business just to work?
Yeah, fair. Yeah, I think for us, as when we approach these challenges and work with clients, we try to look at it from the perspective of who are the major constituents within the HR function and within the business who will benefit and use that job architecture, and to what purpose and what end. And that gives you a starting point to understand what is the level of granularity that's required to execute those sort of functions that helps you drive your automation process, help you drive your skill adjacency conversations, your internal talent marketplaces, all of which are based on the back of that job architecture. And yes, comp and ben, right? So that's a starting point. The tricky part historically has been maintenance. And so one of the things we've done in our technology is to try to really address that by anchoring the job architecture with our labor market intelligence data. So we gather job posts for about 120 countries, about 1 million unique job posts per day. That gives us visibility into how jobs are changing, how skills are changing, how task expectations are changing. We can bring those changing expectations as a form of recommendation into the tool to then suggest how these job architectures and roles should evolve against the way the market is evolving. And that is a game changer, because historically, the way that these get maintained is they go out of date. No one's actually owning that as a dynamic sort of process. And then you bring in a contract of some kind, typically spending hundreds of thousands of dollars over 18-month to 2-year windows to get all these things updated. We take a fundamentally different approach and say, we know how they should be updated because we have all the market data to see how the market's evolving and how it's changing. So we can do it dynamically. That allows you then the freedom, David, to go down another level or two because you have an ability to keep up with it, to keep up with that level of granularity because it's informed by market intelligence.
I would say that, so that would lead to then obviously a degree of relevancy, which that's going to make more sense to your average manager, let's say. Just a little bit sort of dating myself. I remember doing years ago, probably more than 20 years ago, going out into an organization and doing competency card sorts, which is sort of a precedence for job architectures, right?
Yeah.
And I just sort of learning a lesson even then that kind of mapping to roles will fall apart the moment a supervisor doesn't understand it. So I imagine the same is true for job architectures. And the data that you're depending on is a way to keep them living and viable and making sense to management, not just HR.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I think when you inform them with sort of dynamic, agile updates based on actually what's happening in market and potentially in your industry, it creates a higher degree of relevancy, to your point, and credibility to the way that these things have been defined. The other key thing that we do in our model is we define all the job architecture at a parent level so that it's consistent and structured and serves as a backbone for all the things we just mentioned. But we also allow a degree of flexibility for individual managers to add or remove skills, add or remove tasks for their particular team in ways that allow them to manage the team more accurately to what their team actually is tasked with doing. But we don't change the parent job architecture. So we've created a separation, almost like a configuration layer, so that those folks can even more fully tailor what they need to their specific experiences on their teams while still maintaining the job architecture at a company level.
Which gets to my next question. What that says to me is that you're connecting the way that work is defined on the ground, which would become a foundation for what we'd really always wanted to do all along, which is this thing called workforce planning, and most organizations weren't doing it, right? So if you are the HR function or wherever workforce planning sits, how is what you're describing helping you move from traditional just sort of job boards and headcount planning to something that is more skills-based, or at the very least, just more connected to reality?
Yeah. Great question. So I view it as foundational. I think there are two pieces of it that really matter. The first is skills. So one of the key things you're going to do when you start thinking about strategic workforce planning, if you're doing it with any degree of diligence, is you want to start figuring out where you should build, where you should buy, where you should borrow, where you should look at internal mobility strategies. And all of that is very difficult to do in the absence of a skills-based language. So as an example, from a build standpoint, you want to understand the degree of adjacency that somebody has today for the requirements of the jobs that you're most needing to fill. You can't do that in the absence of a skills language in a meaningful way at scale across especially global organizations. Concurrent to that and adjacent to that is the notion of task-driven automation, We have a core belief that when we see automation, whether that's industrial automation, whether that's Gen AI or business process automation, that stuff is happening at a task level. The tasks within the jobs will be taken over by AI or augmented by AI. In order to do accurate predictions of the role that automation is going to play against any given role, you really need to understand what tasks that role performs and be able to connect the dots to then do accurate automation prediction and then eventually agentic prediction of what thing agents are going to take over. So if you don't have that foundation, I mean, honestly, I don't know how you're making any of those decisions. Like, it's guesswork. If you don't have a solid foundation of tasks per role, you don't have a solid foundation of skills, you're missing some of the key componentry that would drive an SWP strategy.
Well, obviously, we've been focusing a lot recently on this question of human and machine interaction design. So how do we get beyond just deploying AI tools and then treating them like they've been traditional technologies, where then we just do upskilling and change work to kind of integrate them, realizing that that only is going to get you so far. And it's a moment where we're actually going to need to think differently about the work from moment one. Sort of how do the humans and the AI, what do they each do differently? Almost to the point you're getting at. One of the things that struck me in this work is how much this movement towards first AI workflows and then eventually agents is just sort of holding a mirror up to the organization, letting it see that actually what it understood about its work tasks was already not particularly good. And to some degree, how much we were betting on the fact that humans are just fuzzy and flexible, make up for the fact that we may be, even in organizations where it's remarkably process-based, think manufacturing, what have you, they still, maybe they have a 90% fidelity view of work tasks. And 10% is just, oh, we don't know it. The humans just do it. The humans make it up, right?
The fuzzy judgment.
Right. And so what's happening is it holds up this mirror and we realize, wait a minute, we actually didn't really understand our work as well as we thought. To your point, like, so how do you move forward without stopping and wait? We actually have to better understand how value was created here all along.
Yeah. That's such a great observation, David. I mean, I'd say two things, right? Like, so earlier in the year, I was on a panel, and one of the comments I made is that we're still a little bit making a mistake, I think, to think of Gen AI like it's other software.
Oh, yeah,
and
absolutely.
Other software is deterministic. It follows a pattern. And we want agents to now do things that feel human. But to your point, the problem is humans are both probabilistic and deterministic, right? We can be very rote, and that's why humans were good at assembly line work until it was taken over by machines. And it's also why humans can invent E equals MC squared and come up with brand new, like, conceptual frames for science and innovation. Humans can do both. And so I think, to your point, a lot of organizations have not recognized the extent to which human judgment and discernment and creativity in the moment and the ability to deal with ambiguous situations and then make good decisions. I think we're at a place where the design of work, the design of individual roles, and the way that tasks intersect within a role and across an org function, I think we're at an inflection point. And I think, like, this notion of, like, HR no longer should be about managing just the workforce, but also thinking about how to redefine and reorganize the work itself.
Sure.
It's going to lead us in that direction where we get much more astute and insightful about how the work percolates through the business and what those gap areas are.
And I think those two things, work and workforce, increasingly are going to be changing at the same time. So one can't, but they have to be inputs to each other. Right?
Yes.
So I guess that gets back to a question in terms of what you all are doing on your platform and such. How are we collecting data? How are we evaluating? What are effective ways to bring in intelligence from the ground that tells us how a skill is changing, tells us how the work might be changing, helps to spark our imaginations as to sort of where the organization's going?
Yeah. So there's a few things we do on that front. One of the more interesting capabilities we have is to help organizations build driver models, to actually build, in some cases for the first time, a relationship between the work that an individual performs and the desired work output. There are simple examples that we could all imagine, like with recruiters. The relationship is, well, how many people are the recruiter hiring over what time frame? Then you can determine how many recruiters you need. You can do that for any job in the business and then connect it back ultimately to growth, ultimately back to innovation, speed, pace of change, et cetera. So that's a thing that enables us to have insight into that work connection between the people and the skills and the tasks that they perform, to then have an opinion about how that stuff is changing. So that's one angle. The second is we use a lot of AI and our own detection via our labor market intelligence, where we're catching all of the job posts in the world, to start to anticipate how roles are changing, how tasks are changing, how skills are changing. And so we create a future job profile that's 18 months out of how we think the tasks and the skills and the automation potential of that role will evolve, so that we always have a forward-facing view that we can start to influence at least how we think about the roles. With the driver models, you can start to think about the definition of the work itself, and then create scenario models and what-if planning to then model out different ways that could manifest.
Specifically related to AI, what's an example of something that you've found recently that you would already say, this is how a leader in our client organization should evolve their job architecture given how well we've already seen a particular skill change?
Yeah, well, I would say at a macro level, most of the job architecture work we're doing today is about bringing the job architecture down a level or two, right? So there's a much grosser, less fine problem space, which is that software engineer is the endpoint.
Sure.
So step one is get to the right level of granularity. Then step two is where does AI fit in? And AI fits in two places. One, within the skill profile itself around the expectations of that individual role. But then the second is in that task layer of which part of this job is no longer going to be done by a human, or which part of this job will be done in a way that's augmented by AI. So we try to hit both of those angles. And I think what we're seeing increasingly is skills like prompt engineering, the ability to interact with an LLM, in some cases the ability to write agents are becoming things, or bots at least, are things that are starting to permeate across not just tech jobs. You see that sometimes in marketing roles now. You're starting to see it in HR roles where there's an expectation, almost like if you remember, 20 years ago, data analytics wasn't a skill HR needed, right? But now it's in every job. It's an expectation of HR that they are data savvy. We're starting to see the same thing emerge with AI, that it's no longer just a tech expectation. It's starting to spread out across many different job functions.
It makes sense. But can I ask you, are you seeing evidence of kind of the opposite, that you hear leaders of the big hyperscaler tech companies basically starting to say, if you're a computer science grad, you need that minor in creative writing because that's where this is headed, right? Are you seeing the tech jobs bring the humanities back in?
I haven't seen that. I think that's been more of a forward-leaning point of view from some of those tech leaders.
Right.
We haven't seen it manifest too much in job posts yet, but I think we will. Ultimately, some of the things that are the heavy lifting technical skills are going to be really well handled by AIs, and some of them already are. It's going to get better and better. So then what's left? It's going to be discernment, judgment, creativity, the ability to effectively communicate, persuade. So those human durable skills, I think, are going to become increasingly important, even in technical-oriented job roles. But we haven't really seen, I don't think, a major shift yet in the way people are posting. I think we will. I think you're correct, but we haven't seen it yet in the data.
Great. Thanks. Well, I'm going to wrap us up there. David, thank you so much for coming. This has been a tremendously fascinating conversation, starting with job architectures and then going farther afield from there.
Yeah.
Thank you, audience, for joining us here today. Please like us and subscribe wherever you found us, and look us up on social media. We'd like to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious.
Thank you.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.